An arrogant professor entered the lecture hall with an air of overwhelming authority, clutching a complex problem that she believed no student could possibly tackle. It was her way of subtly asserting her dominance, declaring that here, she alone stood at the pinnacle. But what she didn't expect was that the one who solved those problems with ease was an elderly janitor, whom she had always looked down upon. With just a few strokes of the chalk, the professor stood silent. Genius, it seems, sometimes arises from the most humble places. That morning, the atmosphere in the large lecture hall at Bay Area University was unusually lively. Students filled the room to capacity, with seats taken even before the lecture began. Those arriving late had no choice but to stand by the walls or squeeze onto the stair steps. Everyone eagerly anticipated the special lecture by Professor Emily Carter, a well-known figure on social media and in academic circles, famous for her sharp critiques and her willingness to openly challenge the famous personalities she considered products of privilege and luck. "Today is going to be a spectacular fall from grace," a student whispered excitedly to a friend upon seeing the lecture title on the screen. Genius or privilege, the truth behind success myth. Emily entered the classroom 5 minutes late, not due to traffic or other matters, but because she did it on purpose. She believed that being a few minutes late would create a star effect, making the crowd even more eager with anticipation. Indeed, when the doors swung open and Emily appeared, walking confidently in her high heels and perfectly tailored blazer, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said with a light smile, adjusting her glasses and placing her coffee cup on the desk. "Let's get right to it. Today, I will show you why those whom the world praises as geniuses are, in fact, nothing more than products of a privileged system, where opportunity is not equally distributed." With those words, the screen behind her lit up with images of tech billionaires, among them a large portrait of a man who had been hailed by the media as a genius of the age, someone famous for his work in technology, known as Elon, or at least that was the name Emily intended to use as a model for her argument. They tell you he is a genius, that the formulas behind electric cars, space rockets, and artificial intelligence systems all come from his superior mind. "But what's the truth?" Emily said as she clicked to bring up a slide showing government subsidies and investment networks tied to that figure. "The truth is, no one person creates these things alone. The truth is, when you're born with a ticket to the most prestigious door, all you have to do is walk through it. Meanwhile, others, no matter how talented, are blocked right from the threshold." The room nodded in agreement. The atmosphere felt like a demystification session, with everyone eagerly awaiting the professor to expose the truth behind the success legends. Emily sensed this. She relished the feeling of power, being the one to guide the thinking, to awaken those who still dreamed of fairy tales about overcoming hardship to achieve genius. To reinforce her argument, Emily had prepared a secret weapon, a doctoral-level rocket trajectory integral, long and filled with confusing symbols, triple-layer integrals, variable matrices, and complex nonlinear functions so intricate that even senior engineering students would be overwhelmed. "Here," Emily said, turning to the board and starting to write with sharp, confident strokes, "this is the type of problem that the world's best engineers struggle with every day. To optimize rocket trajectories, calculate fuel, adjust angles, and minimize errors in the ever-changing upper atmosphere. Now guess what? Do you think that person could solve this problem by himself, or did he just sign off on the plan?" By the time the problem had covered half the green board, Emily set the chalk down, turned around, and scanned the room, where every gaze was filled with a mixture of astonishment and confusion. "So who wants to try? Who wants to prove they're a genius like those media outlets claim?" The room fell dead silent. Not a single hand was raised. No whispers could be heard, except for a small, quiet sound from the corner of the room, the faint scraping of a mop against the wall. And then, from the shadows where the sunlight streamed through the bright glass windows, a soft voice spoke. "May I try?" Emily froze. The whole class turned to look, and from that moment on, the story, what seemed like a performance solely for Emily, took an unexpected turn in a direction no one, not even Emily Carter, could have seen. The moment the question echoed from the corner of the room, the atmosphere in the lecture hall immediately shifted, as if someone had pressed pause on a film nearing a tense climax. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly, her sharp eyes behind thin glasses quickly glancing toward the source of the voice. She was accustomed to students hesitating before such challenging problems, but she hadn't expected the first person to speak to be the janitor who swept the halls every morning, Margaret Maggie Thompson. In her old, faded blue janitor's uniform, scuffed shoes and curly hair speckled with silver, Maggie leaned lightly against the handle of her mop. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something very different. It wasn't the hesitation of someone who had accidentally spoken out of turn, nor the youthful eagerness of the motionless students sitting in front of her. It was the look of someone who had seen the problem on the board and remembered something familiar, like a long-buried memory suddenly resurfacing after years of being hidden under the dust of time. Emily pressed her lips together slightly, hiding a bit of unnecessary embarrassment before regaining her usual authoritative posture. She took a step forward and said, with a tone half serious, half mocking, loud enough for the entire class to hear, "Oh, of course, if you want to give it a try, go ahead. I always encourage enthusiasm, no matter where it comes from." A few students chuckled softly, their eyes mixed with curiosity and skepticism, as Maggie gently leaned her mop against the wall, removed her old rubber gloves, and took steady steps toward the podium. To them, Maggie was still just the elderly janitor who, every morning, scrubbed the second-floor hallway. The one who would nod and greet students but whose name no one could recall, whose presence was rarely noticed. She was like one of the familiar, overlooked fixtures of the school, diligent, silent, and invisible. None of them knew that, over 3 years ago, Maggie Thompson had been honored as the best math student in the state, that she had made waves in regional academic competitions with her innate talent and fierce passion for numbers. They didn't know that Maggie once had a big dream, one where she walked the prestigious university halls, pursuing applied mathematics with a desire to find models to solve real-world problems in dynamics and space physics. But life doesn't ask if you have enough passion. When her mother fell seriously ill, bedridden in their rundown house in the poor southern part of the city, all the burdens fell on the shoulders of the 17-year-old girl. She had to drop out of school, leaving behind sleepless nights with the blackboard and thick books filled with formulas, to dive into an unending string of manual labor jobs, working at a breakfast diner, cleaning houses, and eventually becoming a janitor at this very university. It was a place where every day, Maggie walked past lecture halls filled with knowledge, sat for a moment in the hallway listening into lectures, then quietly returned to her mop and bucket. Emily, of course, didn't know and didn't care to guess about that story. In her eyes, Maggie Thompson was just another middle-aged woman making a fool of herself in front of hundreds of students. However, Emily still stepped aside, folding her arms in front of her chest, raising an eyebrow with a knowing expression, as if silently thinking, "Fine, let her try. Then everyone will see that not just anyone can step up to this podium." While the class whispered and murmured, Maggie picked up a marker, gently twisting her wrist to reacquaint herself with the sensation of holding a pen. On the large board, she glanced over the problem, lips pressing together slightly, eyes scanning the integrals, the auxiliary parameters, and the boundary conditions that Emily had deliberately added to increase the difficulty. And then, instead of hesitating or showing fear before the long list of calculations, Maggie merely nodded, a small, determined nod, as if she had returned to the place where she truly belonged. Amidst the endless rows of numbers, the complex variables, the chaotic motion matrices where if you focus long enough, everything would eventually fall into place. The silence was so deep that one could hear the sound of the marker against the board as Maggie began to write the first few lines. And from that moment on, no one in that room knew that they were about to witness something they would never forget for the rest of their student lives. The first marks appeared on the whiteboard as if written by a hand that had practiced countless times. Each graceful curve of the integral sign, each tiny exponent placed in perfect position with no mistake, everything unfolding with such skill that it left the observers bewildered. Maggie didn't pause to think for long, nor did she hesitate like a student worried about making a mistake. She wrote as if these formulas had already been imprinted in her memory, waiting to be unleashed after decades buried under the weight of life's struggles. Standing next to the lectern, Emily's initial air of arrogance slowly turned into quiet suspicion. Her eyes, so accustomed to reading students through every glance and furrowed brow when facing tough problems, now failed to gauge Maggie's demeanor. There was no sign of hesitation, no awkwardness of someone who hadn't touched specialized knowledge in years. Instead, there was calm detachment, as though Maggie were not solving a complex space dynamics problem, but simply revisiting the simple division exercises of her childhood. The room grew eerily silent, a stillness so thick that even the smallest sounds became pronounced. The scratch of the marker on the board was clearly audible. The ceiling fan above creaked in a way that seemed to delve deeper into the already tense air. In the middle row, a mechanical engineering student slowly bowed his head, staring at his notebook, comparing the steps Maggie had just written. His eyes blinked rapidly as though he couldn't believe what was unfolding before him. Then he gently nudged his elbow against his friend beside him, whispering, his voice trembling, "Everything. It's all correct." Emily caught the whisper, though it was barely audible over the deathly silence. She furrowed her brow, biting her lower lip slightly, a strange, uncomfortable feeling rising within her that she couldn't name. This wasn't a problem meant to be solved by just anyone, let alone a mere outsider, let alone a janitor. This problem was a testament, the cornerstone of a belief Emily had pursued for years, that the intricate complexities of great works could only be achieved by systems, by elite academic collectives, not by individuals, especially not by ordinary people with no privileges or resources. And yet, here was Maggie, the woman Emily walked past in the hallway every morning without sparing a glance, step by step, stroke by stroke, dismantling a truth Emily had believed for so long, like snapping a dry twig in two. Emily glanced around the classroom. It was bad. The students had started to notice too. They no longer looked at the board in confusion, but with astonishment, even excitement. Some had already begun pulling out their phones to record, surely aware that this video wouldn't stay within the walls of the school. A few names flitted through Emily's mind. Newspapers, renowned educational columns, analysis pieces. The more she thought about it, the tighter her chest became, as though a meticulously planned scheme was about to fall apart right before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Meanwhile, at the board, Maggie continued writing, each line steady, her left hand brushing away excess chalk, eyes never leaving the problem. She paid no mind to the gazes of others, to the whispers, or the phone's sneaking pictures. She focused solely on each variable, each limit, each derivative, gradually coming closer to the complete solution. Perhaps, in that moment, Maggie wasn't standing in the Bay Area University lecture hall at all, but sitting in her dingy room at 17, surrounded by piles of old books borrowed from the public library, before fate had crushed her dreams. When complex problems still brought her joy after long, exhausting shifts. Then, after nearly 10 uninterrupted minutes of writing, she set the marker down. The room remained silent, but this time the silence wasn't because no one dared approach the board. It was because no one could believe that they had just witnessed a woman in her 50s, dressed in a faded janitor's uniform, solving a problem that Professor Carter had openly challenged the entire class to attempt, declaring no one could solve. Maggie turned, gently placed the marker on the table, and her eyes briefly met Emily's for a split second. She didn't smile, nor did she gloat, just a slight nod, polite enough, as though a former student was returning to a familiar classroom to remind that she had never forgotten the lesson. Emily froze. She couldn't think of anything to break the silence. Her mind spun as if all her years of teaching experience, sharp arguments at the lectern, had suddenly been blown away. She knew she needed to regain control. She knew she had to say something, anything, before everything slipped completely out of her hands. But before she could speak, a student from the third row dropped his pen onto the desk and softly asked the question Emily feared most. "Professor, she really got it all correct, didn't she?" And before Emily could answer, Maggie quietly turned and made her way back to her seat, silently picking up her mop as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as though those extraordinary feats were nothing more than routine for someone who had missed her entire youth due to fate. And then, like the prelude to a great storm that had only just stirred on the surface of the sea, as Maggie returned to her seat and carefully placed the mop in the familiar corner by the wall, she gently adjusted the faded headscarf on her head, lifting her sleeve to wipe away the bead of sweat on her forehead. It seemed as though everything had come to an end, as if it had merely been a rare impulse from a janitor woman who wanted to stir up the classroom atmosphere. and now it would sink back into silence, allowing the order of the lecture to resume. However, just as Emily was about to speak, to regain control, something she knew she had lost the moment Maggie finished writing the final line of her solution, that hand slowly rose again, steadily and unwaveringly, without hesitation. The entire lecture hall turned their heads simultaneously, their gazes now no longer merely those of subtle mockery from earlier, but mixed with curiosity and an inexplicable unease. That woman, who had just shattered the silence with an unbelievable performance, now wanted to say something else. In the dense air, only Emily maintained her calm demeanor. But beneath that composed exterior, she could feel the rising undercurrent of discomfort swelling in waves. Part of Emily could not accept allowing Maggie, an outsider, someone who wasn't even on the student list, let alone a janitor, to take the center stage of the lecture she had meticulously prepared. The countless weeks of studying data, the many nights spent crafting slides and adjusting the problem to make it weighty enough to prove the argument about privilege and the absurdity of the genius myth, were now nearly toppled by the most ironic image she had never anticipated. A middle-aged black woman in a faded janitor uniform, standing there, mop in hand, having just solved a problem that should have left everyone silent. Emily smirked slightly, a thin smile full of control, tinged with a subtle mockery, as if showing the class that she was still in charge, even though everything was veering off the desired course. "It seems you haven't finished your point," Emily spoke, her voice gentle yet cold, as if encouraging her, but in reality trying to corner Maggie into saying something foolish to break the brief glow she had just ignited. Maggie didn't rush to answer. She walked back to the board with the calm of someone who had endured enough bitter battles in life to understand that haste never helped. She took the pen again, not looking at Emily nor seeking the class's approval, but instead focusing on the solution she had just completed. Her eyes narrowed as if scanning once more what she had written. Then, with a voice deep enough for all to hear, Maggie spoke, light yet firm. "This solution is correct, but it can be improved. I noticed in the calculation step between the troposphere and stratosphere, the modeling of the fuel ratio has a point that could be optimized to reduce thrust loss at the highest max speed." Her words struck like a blade, tearing apart the already taut atmosphere. Each word Maggie pronounced, slowly and precisely, made the air in the lecture hall, which had just settled, grow heavy once more. Emily paused for a moment, her hand tightening around the pen she held, realizing that Maggie hadn't just solved the problem, which was already hard to swallow, but now she had dared to openly suggest an improvement. Not the vague hint of an outsider, but pointing directly at the most crucial part where Emily herself had considered but accepted to leave as it was, because she couldn't find a better solution. The entire class was stunned. The engineering students leaned forward to get a better view, some immediately jotting down notes, while others secretly opened laptops to run simulations based on the formula Maggie had added to the board. Emily could no longer stand still. She stepped closer to the board, pretending to examine the work. But in reality, she was searching for a flaw, a mistake she could immediately point out to reverse the momentum that had tilted dangerously in Maggie's favor. But every number, every multiplication and division, every integral sign was neat, precise, and flawless, to the point that Emily couldn't puncture it with any of the arguments she had used to overpower her students over the years. An uneasy feeling crept in, painful, like a cold needle spinning in the palm of Emily's tightly clenched hand. She understood that at this moment, the situation was beyond her control. Maggie was no longer the free entertainment to embellish her argument. She had entered the heart of the lecture, not just with her talent, but with the one thing Emily hated most: the truth. Emily swallowed hard, her lips twitching slightly, but in the end, she couldn't find a reasonable rebuttal and stood silently, relinquishing all the attention in the room to the woman she had never once bothered to even glance at before. And Maggie, after writing the final line of the improvement proposal, gently placed the pen down, returned to her corner of the class, and resumed her familiar task, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, leaving Emily standing alone before the eyes of hundreds of students who were waiting for the most reasonable explanation she would ever have to give in her life. The moment Maggie placed the marker down on the table and quietly returned to her corner of the classroom, the atmosphere in the lecture hall remained suspended in a breathless tension. as if all 100 people sitting there were waiting to see what would happen next. And strangely enough, it seemed that Maggie was the only one not caught up in that intense whirlpool of anxiety. She didn't look around, didn't seek admiring glances, nor did she listen to the murmurs of the students growing louder by the second. All she did was stand up calmly, slowly walk toward the board again, as if something had been left unfinished, as if what she had just done was merely the warm-up. Emily, though trying to hide it, felt her hand holding the marker tremble ever so slightly, just enough for her to notice and startle at the sensation. After years of teaching, she had never faced this feeling. Her opponents at the lectern had always been inexperienced students, ones who weren't skilled enough to make her truly cautious. But this time, the person standing beside her was not a student, nor a peer of equal standing, but a woman from a social class that both society and Emily had long considered as the silent gears, existing only to serve, to clean, to remain in the shadow of others' glory. Maggie took the marker as though it were the most familiar object in the world, with no awkwardness or hesitation. She lifted her eyes to the board, her gaze sweeping over the equation as if reuniting with an old friend, with no sense of unfamiliarity or challenge. Each variable, each differential change, every integral and derivative seemed to be etched in her memory from the days long past, when Maggie was still a 17-year-old girl staying up late under the oil lamp in a shabby house in the poor district of the southern city, solving advanced problems in preparation for the state math competition, which she had won first prize in. And then, while Emily was still trying to maintain a calm exterior, Maggie had already started writing. The first steps of the solution appeared on the whiteboard like steady breaths, not rushed, not flustered, but confident and seamless, as if they were meant to be written in that way. She didn't just follow the usual solution. She skillfully rotated through various approaches, handling each complex variable with subtle transformations, making many students who were paying close attention nod in admiration. Emily could feel the shift in the students' gaze. While they had initially looked at Maggie with suspicion, even disdain, now their eyes were fixated on her every stroke, as if they were witnessing a high-level performance at a scientific conference. And worse, for Emily, in those gazes, there was even a flicker of doubt directed at her, the one who had just firmly asserted that this problem was beyond anyone not trained with deep formal education for many years. Emily swallowed down the discomfort rising in her throat, for she was beginning to realize that everything was going completely off script. Maggie was not only solving it correctly, that was already obvious and undeniable by any sharp argument, but more importantly, the way Maggie approached the problem revealed an independent, sharp, and especially flexible mindset, which Emily had often emphasized in her lectures as the rarest trait of truly exceptional minds in applied mathematics. Emily had imagined this lecture would end with a triumphant conclusion, where she would guide the students to conclude that success in modern society was mostly a result of privilege, of closed doors that only a few were invited to enter. But now, in this room, Maggie Thompson, a woman with no privileges, no status, no degrees, was gradually breaking apart that very argument with a language no one could deny: numbers, formulas, and the absolute precision of mathematics. Maggie continued writing a few more lines, carefully, as though making sure that the solution was not only accurate, but also the easiest to understand for the students following along. And when the last line was written, when the solution had been neatly simplified, she turned around, glanced across the classroom, and gently placed the marker down on the table, with no self-praise, no arrogant gestures, just quietly returning to her corner where the mop was waiting. At that moment, Emily stood still, her eyes following Maggie's back, and in her mind, questions began to form, questions that were not easy to answer. Who was this woman? Why had someone with such talent had to bury it all these years in the role of a janitor? And most importantly, the question that troubled Emily more than anything: had she truly understood what privilege really meant all this time, when right in front of her now was the most vivid proof that talent sometimes still exists despite the harshest barriers life can throw? While the class was still in shock, Emily clenched her hands behind her back, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't yet name. And for the first time in many years of teaching, she felt as though she was on the edge of a defeat, and her opponent didn't even bother to claim victory. When Maggie turned back to her corner of the classroom, her hand released the marker, and her gaze returned to the quiet expanse outside the window. Emily thought everything had ended right there. An unexpected incident, a brief moment of awkwardness passing through, and then life would go back to normal. After all, Maggie was just an outsider, an anonymous janitor with worn shoes and a thin coat that couldn't keep her warm in the middle of winter. Emily had already started considering a lighthearted joke or a clever summary to smooth over the atmosphere that had been momentarily disturbed. But before she could speak, Maggie gently raised her hand once more, this time not to ask for permission to speak, but simply to catch everyone's attention. Before she took a few steps toward the board, where the math problem she had just solved still stood, waiting to be completed, as if it, too, was awaiting continuation. Emily furrowed her brow for a moment, a sense of discomfort rising from deep within her chest, but she maintained a calm expression, slightly tilting her head as if to silently allow her to continue without offering any overly warm invitation. Maggie didn't look at Emily, nor did she seek anyone's approval with her gaze. She simply stood there, picked up the marker, and began to write, this time in a smaller, more careful script, as if conversing quietly with the problem rather than performing in front of the 100-odd people holding their breath in anticipation. The issue with this calculation method, Maggie said slowly, speaking and writing at the same time, her voice steady and even, not too high or low, just enough for every corner of the room to hear, lies in the transition between the troposphere and the stratosphere. Here, the fuel ratio is calculated using a simple linear model, leading to thrust loss as the air density decreases rapidly. But if we apply a dynamic correction factor based on changes in air density with altitude, we can minimize fuel waste during this phase. As soon as she finished speaking, Maggie quickly sketched a small diagram beside her, then immediately wrote down a new formula, not as lengthy as the earlier solution, but strikingly sharp. A refined adjustment that even the top students in the class had to furrow their brows at, seriously comparing it with their own solutions, nodding vigorously once they realized its superior feasibility. Emily took a small step back, her right hand unconsciously hanging by her side while her left tightened around the forgotten folder on the lectern. The numbers, the symbols Maggie had just written, Emily had thought of them before. In fact, she had once attempted to apply this correction model in her simulations, but she had discarded it, unable to figure out how to stabilize the dynamic coefficient at high aerodynamic limits. Yet now, right before her eyes, here was someone with no doctorate, no laboratory, no academic titles, calmly writing down the solution, as if it had always been there, just waiting for someone to pick it up. Whispers began to ripple through the class, growing louder and spreading from the front rows to the back of the auditorium. One student, unable to contain their astonishment, leaned over and quietly spoke to their neighbor, but the whisper was loud enough for those in front to hear. She just improved the professor's problem. Emily heard every word, every syllable, as if each one was a needle pricking her skin. The calmness in her eyes began to fracture, not because of Maggie's brilliance, after all, Emily had encountered many talented individuals in her life, but because everything Maggie was doing today, right here, was directly opposing the foundational arguments Emily had spent her career building. The theory of privilege, of a system that favors only a few, of the notion that no one can rise from the bottom of society without having a secret door open for them. All of it was violently shaken by the quiet existence of Maggie Thompson, a simple woman burdened with days of manual labor to earn a meal and medicine for her loved ones, who suddenly stepped forward, gently but surely demolishing the proud assertions of a university professor with sharp theses and the applause of a familiar audience. Emily looked at Maggie for the first time with a gaze that genuinely wanted to understand, not to judge or view her as an opposing force in her lecture. She couldn't help but ask herself, how could someone like Maggie, someone whom society had long since decided should endure the lowest of jobs, be able to not only solve the problem correctly, but go even further, stepping into a realm that even Emily herself had once hesitated to approach? In that moment, Emily realized, perhaps it was she who was being demystified, struck face first by a harsh truth she had always denied. That talent doesn't only reside in academic chairs, in grand conferences, or in offices filled with books. Sometimes it quietly exists in the calloused hands and faded uniforms of a janitor that society has never bothered to look at for more than a passing glance. And just as Emily was lost in the chaos of her thoughts, Maggie set the pen down once more, returning to her corner of the classroom with her usual calm demeanor. leaving behind on the board not just the expected solutions, but formulas beyond expectation, an unspoken but sharp reminder that not all truths lie within the textbook. The numbers on the board remained intact. No one dared to erase them, standing as a blatant testament to the truth that had just exploded. A truth Emily couldn't find a way to deny or twist. The atmosphere in the lecture hall was still thick, as if no one had truly come to terms with what they had just witnessed. And then, in that moment of silence, the soft clack of a student's keyboard from the middle row broke through, loud enough to shatter the suffocating stillness, like a needle piercing the surface of calm water. A few quick keystrokes on Google with the name Maggie Thompson, and the young student looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and utter disbelief. "Professor, she won first place in the statewide math competition when she was 17, he blurted out, loud enough for the entire lecture hall to hear. Then in disbelief, he quickly turned his laptop screen toward his friend, as though he couldn't quite believe the information he just uncovered in a few short seconds. And so a new wave of murmurs swept through the room. This time it was not the same skepticism or sarcasm as before, but questions filled with urgency, astonishment, and a flood of shocked glances turned toward the corner of the room where Maggie had returned to her usual spot beside the broom. But now no one looked at her as just an anonymous janitor. Phones began to rise, fingers furiously typing to dig up more information, piecing together scraps of her past like a dusty old painting suddenly wiped clean by an unseen hand. Emily stood frozen at the lectern, her heart heavy with an odd mixture of surprise and unease. She had once believed she understood people like Maggie, quiet, small, voiceless, powerless, and without special origins. But now it seemed that even that was just a thin veil she had pulled over her own eyes long ago, to make it easier for her to uphold the cold arguments she had tirelessly repeated throughout her career. Under the expectant gaze of the class, Maggie took a deep breath, then turned around. Her voice rose, not to boast or defend herself, but simply to recount, as though someone had casually asked her about the old days. And after years of keeping it hidden, she was finally ready to speak. "Yes," Maggie said, her voice deep and steady, resonating in the room like a sad symphony from a distant memory. "When I was 17, I won first place in the statewide math competition. At the time, I dreamed of becoming a mathematician, of leaving the poor neighborhood where I grew up, where on those long power outage nights, I had to study math by candlelight, using old books I borrowed from the public library." Maggie paused, her eyes gazing blankly out the window where the sunlight slanted in, as if to remind her that there was still a world beyond, one she had once dreamed of entering but had never touched. "But then my mother got cancer," Maggie continued, her voice unchanged, though her hands tightened slightly on the broom handle, as if holding herself back from shaking. "I had to raise 4 younger siblings on my own, take care of medical bills, rent, and the daily meals. At that time, mathematical formulas couldn't help me pay the hospital bills, couldn't buy a loaf of bread for the kids, so I quit school, entered the workforce, doing everything from waitressing to cleaning houses, and eventually I ended up here." The room fell silent. There was no more chatter. The students who had been skeptical just moments before now only knew how to bow their heads or exchange glances, unsure how to express their emotions in the face of such a raw and bitter story, so far removed from the fairy tale narratives they'd heard about genius overcoming hardship. Maggie didn't speak in grand terms. She didn't embellish her tragedy. Each word, each sentence felt like a gentle but chilling recount, sharper than any critique or sarcasm Emily had ever used to close her lectures with sharp, argumentative conclusions. Emily stood there, quietly listening to the entire story, in a state that felt foreign to her now, a state of someone forced to accept a truth she didn't want to believe. She realized that right here in this very classroom, Maggie was not just breaking the equation on the board by solving it or improving it. She was shattering the very structure of thought that Emily had confidently built as a fortress of logic for all these years, regarding the privileges and limitations of one's background. Ironically, that was not being demonstrated by a scholar, but by a woman who seemed to belong to the lowest strata of society, quietly wiping tables and windows, whose name no one could remember. Maggie's story concluded in a chilling silence, as though every sound in the room had been gathered and locked away in an invisible box. Emily stood still at the podium, her hand unconsciously reaching for the textbook on the desk, grasping for something to hold on to. But the familiar pages suddenly felt alien, as though they no longer had any connection to the ongoing lesson she should have been leading. She should have been the one making sharp conclusions after exposing the myths behind genius and the hidden privileges that fueled their success. Yet what stood before her now was a living paradox, a raw embodiment of a harsh truth her theories had never accounted for. Thompson, a name that seemed like a small, anonymous part of the quiet janitorial staff who cleaned each morning, had not only stepped into the world of mathematics with the bare feet of determination, but had once stood at the pinnacle where the light of mathematical glory seemed reserved for children raised in luxury with expensive tutoring, the best teachers, and unconditional family support. Maggie had nothing but calloused hands, a sharp intellect gifted by nature, and relentless perseverance nurtured by long nights spent in a cold, leaky house, reading old books borrowed from the public library, while her mother groaned in pain and her 4 younger siblings exchanged hungry looks. Emily felt the atmosphere around her thicken. The logical arguments she had once used to defend her theory now crumbled like fragile bricks, falling one by one to expose a cold, empty void behind them that she had never wanted or dared to face. She had built her career on the premise that all success was a product of privilege, of a system of favoritism cleverly engineered for a select few with the chance to enter. For years, she had tirelessly taught her students that stories of overcoming adversity were just a beautiful facade created by the media. That talent alone was not enough, that all efforts were in vain if born at the bottom of society. She had once believed this with certainty, and that certainty had become her sharpest weapon in her presentations, helping Emily solidify her reputation as a bold, progressive scholar. But Maggie was there, sitting quietly in the corner of the classroom, returning to her mop and bucket as if nothing had happened. And she was the first, deepest, and hardest to heal crack in the wall of belief Emily had built throughout her career. What stood before her was not theory, but living, undeniable reality, something that could not be refuted, argued away, or avoided. A Black woman with no privileges, no money, no opportunity, no family support, no academic titles, who had been mercilessly dragged into the depths of poverty, yet she could still stand in this classroom and calmly solve a problem Emily had once believed could only be tackled by minds trained in the best conditions. Emily glanced down at the students below. Their eyes no longer followed her as the absolute source of knowledge. They were looking at Maggie. They whispered to one another. They took notes on the formulas Maggie had just written. Not as they did when writing down lecture notes for the test, but as though they were witnessing something extraordinary. Something that had to be remembered, as if to remind themselves later that today, right here, they had witnessed something that completely contradicted everything they had been taught. Emily suddenly felt herself pushed to the edges of the classroom. Awesome, like a lost passerby in the most familiar space of her life. Worse still, she realized something even more bitter, that if Maggie hadn't worn that janitor's uniform, if she had walked into the room as a guest professor, Emily herself might have been among those who stood up to applaud, praising her brilliance without a second thought. But because Maggie was who she was, or rather because she was no one in Emily's frame of reference, Emily had not believed from the first moment. She had dismissed her, looked down on her, and predicted failure. Now, who was the failure? Emily asked herself this question without needing an answer. The answer was right before her, clearly visible in the eyes of everyone in the room, in every whispered conversation, in every formula that hadn't yet faded from the whiteboard. And for the first time, Emily felt not just that she had lost a math problem, but that she had lost an entire life. Emily stood there staring at the whiteboard where Maggie's formula remained intact, like a silent yet sharp declaration. She could feel the lump in her throat, the feeling she had always thought she was immune to after years of teaching, the discomfort of someone who must face the truth that they were wrong, completely wrong, and wrong even about the things they thought were the most solid foundations. Everything in Emily's theory about privilege, about the social structures that shape talent and opportunity, about how people like Maggie should never have existed in the light of high-level mathematics problems. Everything had just been exposed by Maggie with nothing but rough hands and a sharp mind that had never stopped burning with fire. Yet, strangely, amid the conflicting emotions, doubt, anger, disappointment, and quiet admiration, Emily suddenly had a thought, as if the collapse of her old ideology had opened a completely new path for her, one that was both alluring and dangerous. Rather than trying to save face or regain control in the disrupted lecture, Emily unconsciously took a step toward Maggie, where the woman had just set the mop aside and was now preparing to collect her things and leave the classroom, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Maggie, Emily called, for the first time using her name in the class, not in the tone of a teacher, nor with the underlying sarcasm hidden behind polite smiles, but with a slow, deliberate, almost tentative tone. The class immediately fell silent, all eyes on the two women, one adorned with the prestigious title of professor, the other in a faded janitor's uniform with shoulders worn by years of use. Emily took a soft breath and continued, each word coming out like a decision made with careful calculation. I am currently researching a new mathematical model related to optimizing the carbon cycle in the atmosphere. Honestly, there are still many bottlenecks that I haven't figured out how to solve. If you have the time, I'd like to invite you to look over the model. Perhaps you'll see something that I can't. Even Emily couldn't believe she had just said those words. Throughout her career, she had never invited anyone outside the academic world to participate in her research, let alone someone like Maggie, who just an hour ago, Emily had viewed as an invisible employee in the monotonous machinery of this institution. But now things were different. Emily couldn't deny that Maggie not only understood math, but also possessed a sharp, independent, and bold perspective that even Emily had to respect. Deep down, Emily might have been hoping that somehow involving Maggie in this project would help her bridge the gap that had just appeared in her belief. At least help her understand how Maggie could break the limits that Emily had always thought were insurmountable. Maggie paused for a moment, her eyes quietly meeting Emily's. That gaze was neither doubtful nor ostentatiously surprised. It was as though she was considering a long-term move in a life chess game she had long been forced to play defensively. Emily could clearly see the hesitation in that look, not because Maggie lacked confidence, but because she knew that stepping out of the safety of invisibility meant pulling along a chain of consequences that life had taught her to avoid in order to live peacefully. I'm not sure I can help, Maggie responded slowly, her voice still deep but laced with a sense of careful thought. I'm only used to solving simple problems. Emily chuckled softly, the first smile she'd had since Maggie wrote on the board, but there was no longer any sarcasm, just rare honesty between two people who never thought they'd walk the same path. Well then, let's consider this another simple problem, Emily said, that I need your help to solve. Maggie looked around the classroom. The gazes directed at her no longer carried the mockery they had at the start of the lesson. Now there was admiration, curiosity, and the small hopes of those who had just witnessed living proof that even coming from the lowest depths of society, one could rise through intellect and determination to stand on the podium side by side with those considered the most elite. Finally, Maggie gave a slight nod, just enough not to make it seem too dramatic. All right, she said lightly, I'll take a look. And only Maggie knew that, at that moment, she had agreed to step into a storm far fiercer than the years of poverty, longer than usual hospital night shifts, and abandoned dreams due to family burdens. Because what awaited her ahead would no longer be the lifeless numbers on old paper, but direct confrontations with colossal forces hiding behind scientific projects, ambitions beyond moral limits, and truths far more complicated than any nonlinear system she had ever solved. And Emily, though she couldn't yet put it into words, felt that with that invitation, she had unknowingly sparked an event much bigger than anything she had ever anticipated in her scientific career. Maggie's consent acted as a signal, opening a new chapter full of surprises for both women who seemed to be on opposite sides of a battlefield. A few days after that shocking class, Emily arranged for Maggie to have a private working session in her research room, where the mathematical models of the carbon cycle in the atmosphere, which Emily had been working on for 2 years, were still incomplete, stuck at points that even Emily, despite trying everything, couldn't resolve. The room was a sacred space for Emily, a place where only her trusted colleagues or the best students had ever been allowed to step foot. Yet this time the person she invited was a cleaning woman with no academic qualifications, only hands calloused from cleaning chemicals and long nights scrubbing the cold, empty hallways. Emily had prepared herself to accept the difference. lowering her expectations so as not to put pressure on Maggie. But from the very first minutes Maggie sat before the computer screen, her gaze intensely scanning every line of data. Emily understood that she had underestimated this woman yet again. Maggie not only grasped the model faster than Emily could have imagined, but she also immediately noticed small yet significant gaps in the way Emily had processed the data, gaps that Emily had overlooked, assuming they were insignificant. This sharpness left Emily in awe, but also fed her with a vague unease that she couldn't quite name. Then one afternoon, while Emily was adjusting parameters for an atmospheric dynamics model simulation, Maggie gently called out to her, her voice steady but laced with an unusual tension. "Emily, do you often check the system access logs?" Maggie asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. Emily looked up, frowning at the seemingly irrelevant question. "Occasionally, but the university system has pretty good security. There shouldn't be any issues." Maggie didn't respond immediately. She rotated the screen toward Emily so she could clearly see the access logs Maggie had just reviewed. Subtle traces that only someone truly familiar with the system's operation would notice as unusual. "Someone is stealing your climate model data," Maggie said decisively, without beating around the bush. "They're not copying it in bulk, but downloading small parts at different times, deliberately making it look like random activity to avoid detection." Emily frowned and immediately moved closer to examine the logs. At first, she was ready to dismiss it, thinking maybe Maggie was overly paranoid or had made a mistake in her review. But as she looked deeper and listened to Maggie's analysis, the strange internal IP addresses that appeared during lunch breaks or late at night, the files that were downloaded and immediately erased, Emily began to feel a chill creeping up her spine. "But who would do that?" Emily asked softly, feeling like she had just stepped into a dark maze with no way out. "Is it a student or a technician?" Maggie shook her head slowly. "This method isn't amateurish. Whoever it is knows exactly how the security system works, and they're patient enough to operate over a long period without being detected. This is the work of someone familiar with professional data theft activities." Emily fell silent. A series of names flashed through her mind: colleagues, research assistants, technical staff, even members of the faculty council who sat with her in meetings. But then, an even more terrifying truth crept into her mind, that if Maggie was right, the thief wasn't just stealing data out of curiosity or personal gain. The climate models Emily was researching were not ordinary documents. They contained advanced algorithms for optimizing the global carbon cycle, and in the hands of those with malicious intent, they could be tools to manipulate ecosystems or serve underground projects beyond scientific control. Emily turned to Maggie, her expression filled with worry. "Are you sure? If that's the case, this is beyond my ability to handle internally." Maggie nodded slowly. "I'm sure, and I think the person is still monitoring every change we make to the model. If we want to keep the project safe and ourselves, we need to act before everything is leaked." Her words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. Never before had she imagined that her research work could be linked to such dark conspiracies. But Maggie, with her real-life experience, having lived through the dark corners of life where she was always on guard against what lurked behind the peaceful facade, had seen this danger immediately. From that moment, Emily knew one thing for certain. What had just unfolded was not merely an opportunity for academic collaboration. Her life, which had revolved around numbers and theories, had officially entered a dangerous vortex, where Maggie, the woman she had once looked down upon, was now the only one sharp enough and level-headed enough to help her navigate the shadows hiding right inside the very institution they thought they knew best. And Emily understood that this was just the beginning. The news that Maggie had discovered stolen data spread quickly, like a smoldering spark catching fire in a powder keg within Emily's mind. When Maggie proposed the theory that behind these shady activities could be a sophisticated spy network, Emily wanted to believe it was just an over-the-top assumption, that this school, which she had once believed to be a fortress of knowledge, could never be a cover for such dark schemes. But the more she examined the clear signs, from system logs, from the covert accesses occurring in the dead of night, from the suspicious files being copied and then disappearing without a trace, Emily realized that Maggie was not exaggerating. And when the name Edward Pierce, the veteran professor from the engineering department, a longtime colleague with whom she had taught, written reports, and shared coffee after every meeting, suddenly appeared on the list of people with access at the same time as the stolen data, Emily realized that the truth was colder than any mathematical formula she had ever written. A plan was set in motion within less than 48 hours, proposed and led by Maggie. For the first time, Emily found herself fully trusting the woman whom she had once never bothered to call by name. No one else, it was Maggie, with her sharp intuition and her instinctive understanding of security processes honed by years of survival, who conceived of Project Atmosphere, a sophisticated fake project designed to trick the betrayer into revealing himself. "We can't just accuse Edward based on a theory," Maggie analyzed, her voice low and steady as the group sat around the closed meeting table, attended only by a few internal security investigators and Emily. "We need him to hand over the information himself, and not just any document, but one of such value that he can't resist." Emily looked at Maggie, her gaze slowly filling with respect. "And you think this fake climate project will be enough to hook him?" Maggie nodded slightly, the lines at the corners of her eyes gleaming with an extraordinary calm. "He's been quietly stealing your most complex atmospheric models for months. If you now announce that you've discovered the optimal carbon optimization formula, applicable both on Earth and in extraterrestrial environments, he won't be able to stay away." People like Edward don't just sell data, they sell the dream of power for those pulling the strings behind them. The plan was carried out meticulously, down to the smallest detail. Emily openly announced within the department that she and Maggie were developing Project Atmosphere, a revolutionary mathematical model for controlling carbon levels in the atmosphere through a completely new mechanism, with enormous potential for the energy and environmental industries. Some sophisticated simulations were created by Maggie, enough to convince anyone who glanced at them that they were on the brink of a real breakthrough. The hardest part belonged to Maggie. She had to present the fake documents to Edward in a carefully arranged, seemingly accidental meeting, where Emily purposely invited him under the guise of technical consultation. Maggie had prepared for that moment with the coldness of someone who had tasted enough of life's bitterness, who had weathered storms far larger than this. When she entered the meeting room with the fake documents in hand, she was no longer the quiet woman with a mop. She was a professional with poise. Each word, each sentence about Project Atmosphere carefully considered to be just intriguing enough, just flawed enough, like a deliberately limping bait before the eager predator. And just as Maggie had predicted, Edward couldn't hide the spark of excitement in his eyes from the first few pages. He asked a series of detailed questions, not to verify the feasibility, but to assess the value of what he was about to pass along. Emily, though sitting right there, couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine at Maggie's skillful manipulation, constantly guiding the conversation in a way that made Edward believe he was the only one astute enough to recognize the enormous potential in the fake project. A few days later, according to plan, everything climaxed at the reception of a small, oil-rich nation's consulate with technological ambitions. Emily couldn't attend, but Maggie accepted the most dangerous role. The secret observer, hidden on the mezzanine of the grand hall, her eyes peering through the reflective glass. Maggie witnessed Edward walk in and shake hands with a foreign man, whose elegant exterior was masked by eyes as cold as steel. The file Maggie had especially marked was now firmly in Edward's hands, passed off as a prearranged deal, swift enough that no one else paid attention, but long enough for the hidden camera to capture the undeniable evidence. In that moment, Maggie couldn't help but shudder. She understood that, from this moment on, the game had entered the real life and death stage. The forces behind Edward would not let go easily once they discovered they had been tricked. And Emily, the school, and she herself, those who dared to pull back the curtain on the truth, had unwittingly stepped into the eye of an unstoppable underground storm. Maggie looked down at the service cloth in her hands, suddenly aware that it was trembling. Not from fear, but from the realization that, from now on, she was no longer a nameless witness to secrets. She had become the only one holding the key to all the mysteries. Maggie still remembers that moment vividly. When she looked down from the mezzanine, she saw Edward discreetly handing over the carefully set up documents to the foreign man. And just minutes later, as if on cue, the large doors of the consulate's lobby swung open, and FBI agents in sharp suits with cold eyes stormed in. No one had time to understand what was happening, nor time to flee. As Edward turned to head toward the bar, he was suddenly slammed down onto the table with such force that the glass in his hands shattered, leaving small shards scattered across the polished marble floor. Maggie stood above, observing the entire scene with an incredible calmness. She knew this was just the beginning. Exposing Edward wasn't the end. It was only the first step in a much more complex story than Emily had ever imagined during her lectures on society and privilege. That very evening, in a secure room deep inside the university's research building, Emily and Maggie were summoned to hear an explanation from a senior FBI agent, a man with steel gray eyes, graying hair, and the cold demeanor typical of those who had lived too long in the world of secrets and danger. First of all, he began, his voice flat and emotionless, thank you both. Without your subtlety and courage, we wouldn't have caught Edward in the network of spies he was coordinating. But now I'm afraid things are much more complicated. Emily leaned slightly forward, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Maggie remained still, her sharp eyes as if reading each word the agent was about to say. We've just completed our preliminary analysis of the stolen documents, the agent continued, glancing over a thick file in front of him. And we've discovered that the mathematical models you both developed, particularly the algorithms Maggie improved in the climate project, are not just about optimizing the carbon cycle. They can also be directly applied to aerodynamic analysis systems for chemical weapons, specifically those that rely on the manipulation of toxic gases in urban environments and confined battlefields. The room hung in a breathless pause, as if no one could hear their own breath anymore. Emily rose, staring at the agent as though the words he spoke couldn't possibly be true. But it was Maggie who broke the silence with a seemingly innocuous question that carried the full weight of the issue. You're saying my work could become a tool for killing? The agent nodded without hesitation. Yes, the algorithms you developed to analyze how carbon gases circulate in the atmosphere, when applied to smaller environments like tunnels, buildings, or crowded cities, become the perfect tool for simulating and optimizing the dispersion of toxic gases, maximizing lethality with minimal cost to the attacker. Edward didn't just sell data for money. He sold technology, tactics, and the lives of thousands who have no idea they're the targets. Emily turned to Maggie, her gaze no longer one of admiration as it had been in the past, but now tinged with a hint of fear. You didn't know that these models could be used for that purpose? Maggie shook her head softly, her voice slow and heavy, as though she were swallowing a violent wave. I only thought about the environment, about saving the air, about reducing carbon to protect people. I never imagined that those same principles could be twisted into tools of murder. Outside the glass window, the night sky cast its shadow over the university campus, where the building still glowed, as if life outside remained as peaceful as ever. But Emily and Maggie knew that, from this moment forward, peace was just a thin mask covering a storm that had started swirling the moment those algorithms left Maggie's hands and entered the vortex of ambition and power. Emily rested her hand on her forehead, whispering as if to herself, I invited you here to fix a climate model, but it turns out we're standing in the middle of a real battlefield. Maggie didn't answer. She only looked directly at the FBI agent, then asked in a voice that seemed soft but was strong enough to silence the entire room, so now who will protect the numbers from the hands of evil? And from that question, Emily understood that every social theory, every view on privilege or opportunity, would now have to be rewritten, not just in the cold words of academia, but with the deepest awakening to how knowledge, even when born of good intentions, can be twisted into daggers hidden in the darkness. Maggie's question, who will protect the numbers from the hands of the wicked, still echoed somewhere in Emily's mind as the two of them dove back into the mathematical model. This time, it wasn't just about reinforcing algorithms to close any loopholes to prevent exploitation, but also a quiet race to strip away every vulnerable point from the research. They worked nonstop for days in a hidden research room, surrounded by whiteboards filled with symbols and screens flashing thousands of complex data lines that made anyone who looked at them dizzy. Yet, in the midst of the mounting pressure, something strange began to emerge. Maggie was the first to notice. While reviewing the sequence of aerodynamic flow algorithms she had previously improved, her eyes unwittingly stopped at a recurring string of numbers, out of place with the goals of carbon optimization or climate modeling. At first, Maggie thought it was just random noise in the system, but the deeper she looked into the transformations, the more she sensed something was off. These numbers didn't just appear once, they reappeared regularly, intricately, as if hidden within the core of the problem. slipping past every data cleaning and model restructuring that Maggie had carried out. "Emily," Maggie called, her voice soft but enough to make Emily put down the stack of documents she was holding. "Look at this. Does something seem odd to you?" Emily leaned in. It only took a few seconds of observation before her expression changed dramatically. "No way. This is a segmented logarithmic sequence," she murmured, moving the mouse to extend the code segments, her eyes glued to the screen. "This isn't a system error. It repeats too perfectly, like a fixed pattern." Maggie fell silent, but she could already sense the flicker of a crazy hypothesis forming in her mind. With a quick move, she expanded the scan to include all the models they had built before, not only in Project Atmosphere, but also in other climate change simulations, ocean circulation, and even the atmospheric motion model Emily had developed last year. The result left them both stunned. That number sequence appeared in all of the models. Not only that, but when Maggie tried adjusting the parameters and cross-referencing them with astronomical algorithms, something she had learned from old books in her youth, they discovered that the strange sequence aligned remarkably well with the orbital motion model of certain small planets in the edge of the solar system. The acceleration ratio, oscillation amplitude, even the cyclic rhythm, all matched, as if they were governed by a deeper law no one had ever named. Emily slouched in her chair, eyes wide open, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. It's no longer just a climate model, Maggie. Do you understand? This number sequence can't be random. It's like a trail left through the most complex dynamic systems, from Earth's atmosphere, ocean currents, to the movement of celestial bodies in space. Maggie sat deep in thought, feeling an odd mixture of exhilaration and an unsettling unease that she couldn't quite put into words. She remembered the sleepless nights of her youth, staring out the window of a slum, watching the scattered stars flicker against the pitch-black sky, wondering if the problems she was solving back then had any connection to the far reaches of the universe. And now, when no one had expected it, the numbers were answering that question in a way no one had anticipated. "Maggie, Emily said slowly, each word coming out as though she feared the madness of her own thought. "Do you think this number sequence, could it be a message? Not from the data, but from somewhere else?" Maggie blinked for a moment, at first as if intending to dismiss it as too far-fetched, but then she stopped, considering. In science, the most dangerous thing is to dismiss things you don't yet understand. "A message," she whispered, "or a trace of an intelligence that existed before us or alongside us, leaving a message in the very physical laws we thought we discovered?" The research room seemed to drop into an unspoken, breathless pause as the two women looked at each other, both realizing that what they had just discovered was no longer just a scientific issue. It could be the key to unlocking another layer of secret, the secret of the very structure of the universe, the connection between life on Earth and an intelligence that once intervened in the laws of nature that seemed immutable. Or perhaps it was the way the universe, billions of years ago, had embedded these repeating patterns, like distant drums echoing through time, waiting for the day someone would be patient enough, passionate enough, and intelligent enough to listen. Maggie returned to the keyboard, her hands swiftly gliding over the keys, as if from now on, all the small problems of human life were just stepping stones leading to the final and greatest question: to decode the message of numbers not belonging to humanity. And Emily, for the first time in many years of teaching the insignificance of the individual in the privileged machinery of society, realized that perhaps all those theories must step back in the face of a much greater truth, the truth of an ancient intelligence, older than any power structures humanity has built, whispering through each number, waiting for them to step forward. The night sky outside the research room's window stretched wide, calm as still water, with stars twinkling like tiny dots on the endless map Maggie used to gaze at when she was 17, curled up by the rickety window of the slum house, where only dreams bigger than the evening meal nurtured her youth through cold and hunger. Back then, Maggie believed that those numbers, those beautiful equations, would be the only door to escape the depths of poverty and injustice. But life is not just made of simple calculations. Storms of illness, responsibility, and the struggle for survival swept it all away, pulling her back to the cold earth, turning the dream into a locked box buried deep in her heart. Until today. Until Emily, after all the doubts, skepticism, and prejudice, looked straight into Maggie's eyes with a gaze she never thought she would receive from a prestigious university professor. A gaze of absolute recognition, of respect, an invitation to step out of the shadows and join the ranks of those who lead human knowledge forward. "We can't stop here," Emily said, her voice deep and steady like the precise ticking of a well-tuned machine, but her eyes glowed with a rare passion Maggie had never seen in her before. "Not when these numbers are calling us to go further. Maggie, I want you to officially become a long-term research colleague. We will perfect the climate model, but at the same time, we will uncover the mystery of those numbers." Maggie didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, worn and calloused from scrubbing chemicals, from dragging the mop down cold, empty hallways. She had once thought her life would always consist of such quiet, unnoticed work. No one ever asked her name, much less invited her into world-changing projects. Yet now, in front of her, was a bold proposal, as if destiny had finally come back to repay her the debt of stolen years. Maggie looked up, gazing at Emily for a long time. That gaze no longer carried the hesitation of an outsider or the timidity of someone who had endured too much hardship. Now in her eyes, only the bright light of resurrected belief remained, the fire of an intellect that had been buried but was now rising stronger than ever. "All right," Maggie said slowly, each word leaving her lips as if closing an old chapter and opening a new one. "But I warn you, Emily, we are standing before something far from simple. Those numbers, they're not random. Something or someone has left a mark in every physical law around us. And if we continue, I fear that the secrets behind them won't just be scientific works. They may change how humanity understands itself, or pull us into darker, colder realms than even the most shattered of dreams." Emily smiled gently, a smile mixed with excitement and pride, as though she had been waiting for that answer all along. "I didn't invite you to seek safety, Maggie. I invited you to walk with me to the very end of knowledge, whether ahead is light or darkness." Maggie nodded slightly. She knew well that once the door was open, it could never be closed again. And she also knew this time she would not miss the opportunity to walk through it, no matter what terrifying secrets it held. Secrets greater than any poverty her youth had ever known. Out there, the sky still sparkled. But for Maggie and Emily, the stars tonight were no longer distant, faint lights. They were coordinates, codes, unfinished links of a massive equation stretching across the universe. An equation that now these two women, once standing on opposite ends of prejudice, had become authors of. And this journey had only just begun. And it was the extraordinary journey of Maggie, the poor cleaning woman who once gave up her dream of mathematics, now becoming the key to unlocking the universe's greatest mysteries alongside Emily, in an exploration that would not only push the boundaries of science, but challenge the dangerous forces lurking behind the door of knowledge. But what do you think? Are the mysterious numbers that Maggie and Emily discovered really the traces of an extraterrestrial intelligence? Or just an unexplained natural law? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective. If this story intrigued you and you want to join many more thrilling, suspenseful journeys like this, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any special stories next time. See you at even greater mysteries, where all limits may be broken.